All right, are we ready?
Yep, it's all yours.
Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction, Betsy. And I'm looking forward to talking to you today about using pesticides properly with beneficials in mind. So I wanted to introduce the program a little bit more. So I'm a director and I'm also an educator for Cornell Cooperative Extension's Pesticide Safety Education Program. And as Betsy said, it's CCE PSEP. We were formerly known as PMEP, so you might have heard of that name. We just had a name change to reflect better what we do with the word safety. So we're a nationally recognized leader in pesticide safety education, and we have been for 40 years. And we provide training in the proper use and handling of pesticides, and we promote proper use and handling of pesticides. We promote safety for both applicators and consumers in New York State. So we also serve as a source of objective information about pesticides. If you have any questions about pesticides, please reach out to our team. And I've been here the least amount of time of everybody, so you know, we've got a lot of experts on the team that can help with a lot of different things. All right, so this is an outline of what we're going to talk about today and how to use pesticides properly with beneficials in mind. But first, I want to go over some definitions to get started. So what is a pesticide? So a pesticide is defined as any substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. And so it's really important to note that not all pesticides will kill a pest. For instance, repellents are considered a pesticide because they repel the pest, right? And now we kind of have to define, you know, pesticides are intended for preventing, destroying, repelling pests. And so that intention can come in the form of claims on the product label or also pictures of pests on the label. And then we want to define pest, and that is any living thing that has an undesirable impact on something important to us. So this means that there's really a lot of different types of pesticides, right? Because pests can be things that you normally think of like weeds, insects, and fungus. And so you have herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. But they can also be things like COVID-19, right? Or microorganisms like the ones in your toilet. And so disinfectants and sanitizers are also pesticides. And there's a lot of other examples of pesticides, including growth regulators and rodenticides. So just wanted to keep in mind that, you know, there's a lot of things that we're talking about when we talk about pesticides. And so the goal of IPM and pesticide safety is to effectively manage pests while reducing harm to you, other people, and the environment, right? And harm can be measured as risk. And so I just want to define really quickly, you know, what is risk? It's actually a little more complicated than you might think. So risk is hazard times exposure, okay? And hazard is the amount of danger that something can inherently pose to you. And exposure is whether or not you actually encounter that danger, whether you're exposed to the hazard. So, you know, think for a minute about something that's extremely hazardous. This would be gasoline, okay? It's very toxic to humans if swallowed or inhaled, but we use it all the time to fill up our gas tanks, although recently we might not be using it as much because the price has gotten so astronomical. But gas pumps are designed to virtually eliminate human exposure, right? So the risk when you're filling up your gas tank to you is very low. So this, I just want to keep this in mind because no matter how hazardous something might be, if your exposure is low or zero, then your risk will also be low. So let's start talking about how to use pesticides properly with beneficials in mind. And the first thing I want to talk about, of course, is an IPM approach. So you want to ask yourself, does the pest problem warrant management? Okay, you may be able to tolerate a harmless pest or those that are not causing significant damage. You might be able to rely on landscaping techniques that can increase native habitat while reducing the need for pest management. You just want to know all of the management tools that are in your toolbox, including physical as well as chemical controls. And to know all of that, you want to talk to my wonderful colleagues that are running this conference at the New York State IPM program. So if a management tactic is warranted, that's when you would do a risk-benefit analysis. So here's an example. Let's say you have an active wasp nest above your front door. The benefit to managing this pest is pretty obvious, right? Because if you manage the wasp nest, it will reduce your risk of getting stung every day when you go in and out of your house. You could use an insecticide like Hot Shot to manage the wasps. Okay, so this particular product is inherently toxic to insects, which is pretty obvious because it kills wasps, right? And the label also warns that it's toxic to fish. So it can also pose a risk to you if it gets in your eyes or on your skin or clothing. So those are the risks. But if you use the pesticide according to label directions, you would only spray the nest, and you would avoid spraying near water. You'd be standing upwind and not directly under the nest when applying. And so this should really limit your exposure and exposure to other insects and aquatic life. So risk could be minimal. So does the risk of the wasp above your door sort of outweigh the benefit of removing that threat? And are the risks from the pesticide? This is the kind of thing you have to start thinking about when you do risk benefit analysis, right? And some of this depends on your personal situation. So how high is the nest? How close is it to your door mechanism? Is it near a porch where you eat regularly? Are you or someone else in your house allergic to wasps? Perhaps you're thinking, wait a second, there's another way I could deal with this nest without using a pesticide. I could knock it down with a stick. So yes, this is another option, but I really want to emphasize that it's important when you're doing a risk-benefit analysis to think about the fact that all management options come with hazards and can pose risks, right? So if you're going to be poking this nest with a stick, there's the hazard that angry wasps could fall out of that nest and start trying to sting you. And there's also the hazard that those displaced wasps might try to re-nest on some other part of your house or your property. Okay, so you just have to weigh all of the risks and benefits with all management options. And this is going to depend on a lot of things. Again, like how easy is it to knock down the nest? What species of wasps do you have, and what life stage are you dealing with, right? Is the chance of re-nesting high? How close do you have to be to the nest to use either of these management methods? And I would be remiss not to say that there's a third management option here, which is to call a pest control professional to deal with the situation, okay? So this might be a little more expensive, but the risk would be extremely low to you because you wouldn't be doing the management anymore. It would be the pest management professional. And the likelihood that the problem would be effectively taken care of could be a lot higher because professionals are professionals and they deal with wasps more frequently. So I just wanted to give you that example as an idea of, what does the risk benefit analysis look like? So in order to do that analysis, we have to know the risk that pesticides pose to beneficials. So how do we know what the risks are? Well, I kind of gave you a hint, but basically follow the pesticide label and that will help you here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background of how labels work and pesticide registration in general. So if you don't know this already, pesticides have to be registered by the EPA before they can be sold in the US. Okay. And on top of this, New York, we have our own registration process. And so pesticides must also be registered with the Department of Environmental Conservation before they can be sold, distributed, or applied in this state. And this registration process is meant to reduce risks. So what happens? Well, the applicant provides the EPA with the chemical information and the hazard and risk data and a proposed label. And then the EPA reviews the scientific peer-reviewed data to assess risk, okay? And they use this data that they're asking for to make a risk management regulatory decision. We'll talk about the data in a second. And then when they do a risk assessment, looking at all of those data, it has to meet a regulatory standard. If it does, then they do this risk mitigation measure, okay? So they can put measures in place and identify measures that will reduce risks. And these can include things like label wording changes on the pesticide product, reducing sites, rates, timing, restrictions, and restricting where it can be used, limiting it to only trained or certified individuals, right? If needed, there's also a food and feed maximum residue level that's established. And that ensures the pesticide residues on crops are not posing unreasonable risk to those that are consuming them. If there are no changes needed or mitigation measures are acceptable to the applicant, then the registration is issued, okay? And then the EPA reviews older pesticide products every 15 years. Active ingredients, and then they go through the products. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about how the risk assessment itself works, because I think this will be important to think about for beneficials, okay? So the standard that must be met when a pesticide product is registered is when used according to label directions, the product will not pose unreasonable risk to people in the environment. And the label must be followed. It's actually illegal not to follow the label, okay? So this is kind of a high standard. not posing any unreasonable risk to people or the environment. So how does the EPA meet this standard? What they do is they require data. So these listed categories here are required for all pesticide products before registration. And then in italics, you can see there's actually additional requirements for antimicrobials or other pesticides that claim to control infectious microorganisms of vectors of infectious disease, okay? Because they really want to make sure that those are effective at claiming that to control that disease. So essentially, all of the scientific evidence is needed before a pesticide can be registered. And that includes everything from product chemistry to product performance, hazards to humans, and that really is the priority, of course, right? But then also hazards to non-target organisms. And so I'm going to focus on that today because we're talking about beneficials. So I've highlighted where the risk assessment would impact beneficials. For non-target organism, data is required for birds and mammals, fish and aquatic invertebrates, plants, and pollinating insects. And the testing they do is tier-based. So basically, if they get results from acute toxicity studies that indicate an issue, then they will do longer-term lab or field studies, and then chronic and field studies can happen as well. And so the chronic and field studies are things like invertebrate reproduction, life cycle, plant field studies. The data from the chronic studies estimates the potential for chronic effects. And then if needed, simulated field or field data is also required when you can't predict adverse effects from just the lab studies alone, right? And if the hazards are high. So there's also data that's required on spray drift and environmental fate. And those are used to assess the potential exposure of organisms to pesticides. So the environmental fate data are used to assess the presence and persistence of pesticides in the environment that could result in a loss of usable land, surface water, groundwater, and wildlife resources. They also help estimate expected environmental concentrations of pesticides in habitats where species are threatened or endangered. Okay, so the Endangered Species Act comes into this. And all of these data also help determine the need and appropriate wording changes for labeling. Okay, so all of this translates into labeling that minimizes or attempts to minimize the potential harm to non-target organisms. All right, so we talked a lot about how these things, how the risk assessment appears in the label, but where are you actually going to find that information? Well, the answer is in many places. I think you might think, oh, I'm just going to look for environmental statements, but actually you want to look at the entire label to properly reduce risk to beneficials. So let me give you some examples here. So even in the product information section, you're going to learn something about the formulation of the product, and that can help you get a better sense of what off-site exposure might be to beneficials. So for instance, ant baits could reduce exposure compared to an aerosol spray, right? And ready-to-use products that are pre-mixed would reduce potential exposure if you're going to be mixing and loading products, right? So exposure to beneficials could be lower if they're ready to use. And you could be less concerned about drift on the wind into beneficial habitat if you're using things like pellets or granular formulations. All right, now this section of safety information is mostly geared towards humans and domestic animals, but I really want to highlight it because it's essential that you know what the risks are to you and other people. And you need to protect yourself, not just because that's important, but also because if you're not doing well, you're not going to be able to mitigate risk to beneficials. You're not going to be able to use pesticides properly, right? So in this section of the label, you're going to find signal words which range from caution to warning, to danger poison. And these words let you know how toxic the pesticide is to you. And also in this section, you're going to find the routes of exposure. So there's statements that show you which routes of exposure from the product are most important and of concern. So here you can see that the routes of concern would be through skin or eye contact. And the label tells you what PPE to wear to protect yourself and other precautions to take to minimize your risk. You can always
stick a note in there. Excuse me, Mary. I'm just going to say for PPE is personal protective equipment.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
We're used to hearing it, and not everyone is.
That's a good point. Right. So personal protective equipment, and it can be things like clothing, right? But also eye protection like goggles or a respirator even, or gloves. Thanks, Betsy. So remember, you can always wear more than what's suggested on the label, but you have to, and you must comply with the label. So you have to wear what's there. You can always wear more, be more protective. All right, here's another thing that's on the label is this emergency number. Now this is really important for you, but it's also an important number to have on hand in case there's a spill or poisoning or fire, which might expose beneficials. Another part of the label that you might not think about, but could be really important for beneficials is storage and disposal. So in the storage and disposal section, there's often these statements about ensuring that pesticides are stored separately from fertilizers, food, and feed, okay? So by storing pesticides separately from these things, you make sure that your fertilizer doesn't get contaminated, because then you'd be using it and it could be harmful to beneficials in a way that wasn't anticipated because it's contaminated. Also, the label in these storage and disposal sections tells you how to dispose of pesticides safely, which would minimize pesticide harm to fish, plants, and other living things. The label also tells you general precautions, such as how to reduce drift, how to reduce water contamination, how to reduce exposure. So these are in the environmental hazards section. Maybe this is what you're thinking about most when you think about hazards to beneficials, right? So almost every pesticide label has some statements about not contaminating water during application, while cleaning your equipment or disposing of pesticide wastes. If warranted by the data, you're going to also see some special toxicity statements. So those will say something like, this product is toxic to birds, fish, aquatic invertebrates, wildlife, and pollinators, depending on who it is, okay? And it can even say something like highly toxic, right? So that's what you want to look out for to know what beneficials you want to be most worried about. So the next thing you can do is properly dispose of pesticides. We talked a little bit about this, right? But you never want to dispose pesticides in storm drains or sewer systems or waterways, okay? And you don't want to dispose of them in the sink or the toilet or the sewer or street drain, okay? So many municipal water drinking and wastewater treatment systems are not equipped to remove pesticides. You also don't want to store pesticides in places where flooding is possible. Think about how like a flood might cause a spill, and then the pesticide could leak into wells, drains, or groundwater or surface water, which would impact beneficials. You want to mix and buy only enough pesticides for your pest situation, because storing extra pesticides that aren't needed can be a hazard, right? We just talked about spills. You want to check with your local solid waste management authority or environmental agency to find out, what kind of hazardous waste collection program you have. And in New York, that's Clean Sweep New York. You want to store pesticides in their original label containers, and you never want to reuse empty pesticide containers because there's residues in those containers and they can contaminate the new contents and cause serious harm. So we already discussed that you don't want to store pesticides with other substances like food or fertilizers because of contamination. And you want to keep pesticides, when you store them, away from wildlife, children, or pests, and keep them well ventilated to reduce the chances of vapor building up. Okay, so another thing to talk about is inspecting containers regularly, and this is kind of under the storage of pesticides, right? So you want to make sure that there aren't leaks or corrosion, and you want to use secondary containment. So you want to store your pesticides in a secondary containment situation. So here's an example, like you put it in another bin, right? So that way, if your pesticide container ruptures or there's an unexpected problem with the containment, that spill is really contained into that secondary container, and it doesn't go everywhere else and hurt beneficials. You also want to minimize water contamination. We talked about this quite a bit already, but in addition to keeping the pesticide waste out of water, you don't want to apply pesticides when it's raining or about to rain, because you could get contamination of water in the soil that could drain into lakes and streams. And you don't want to apply pesticides right up against the water's edge. So you can minimize that by leaving some untreated areas between where you're treating and water areas. Okay, so make sure that if you have an aqueous environment near you where there's wildlife, leave a buffer. And you also want to know what pesticides can leach into groundwater. Okay, so pesticides with groundwater contamination potential include this statement that I've put here. This chemical has properties and characteristics associated with chemicals detected in groundwater. This chemical may leach into groundwater if used in areas where soils are permeable, particularly where the water table is shallow. So keep in mind, look for that statement and you would know if there's potential for leaching. You also want to minimize movement and drift. So granules, like if you're using a granular spray, or sorry, not a granular spray, but a granular application, granules that are left on the sidewalk and driveway may wash into storm drains. So you want to sweep those back into the grass and minimize their movement. If it's not specified on the label, you want to apply pesticides when wind speed is low, so between 3 and 10 miles per hour. So there's not drift. And when you're using a pesticide, you want to leave a vegetated buffer strip between you and the area of treatment. So just like we talked about with the water, if you have a lawn, let's say you're next to a forested area, leave a buffer so that you're not applying a pesticide right against that border where wildlife habitat is. Okay, so you only want to treat the specific area that you're having a pest issue, right? So keep in mind that the EPA risk assessment and label precautions rest on the assumption that you're compliant and you're using the pesticide on your labeled site for your labeled pest, okay? If you use it off-site, you'll be posing unaccounted risks to beneficials as well as illegally applying a pesticide. So don't do it. Also, only use the pesticide in the area where the pest is present. So even if the pesticide is labeled for an entire lawn, if you're trying to get rid of weeds in your lawn, and let's say you only have an issue with weeds in one corner, then just treat that area. Don't treat the entire lawn. When you're using pesticides, you really want to consider the environmental fate after use, after each use, okay? And so the physical and chemical properties of a pesticide determine how likely it is that it will travel in the soil, dissolve in water, or become airborne. And so once a pesticide has been applied, it can be broken down by a couple of different things. This includes sunlight, water, other chemicals, and microbial activity, and also plants and animals through metabolism. So you want to pay attention to label statements, and that can help you get a sense of the physical properties of the pesticide and where, how long, and how it will remain in the environment. Next, you want to ensure that liquid pesticides dry before animals or wildlife enter that treated area. So many liquid pesticides pose the greatest risk while they're still wet. So try to apply them so that they will dry before animals enter that treated area. And so, for instance, applying when beneficial insects are least likely to be active will reduce their exposure, right? You also want to minimize exposure to bees and pollinators. And this has been talked about a lot lately. This is close to my heart because I studied pollinators in grad school. But, there's actually, if the pesticide's an outdoor foliar pesticide, it's toxic pollinators, this bee hazard warning is now required. So there's this bee box on the label. The label says to minimize exposure to bees when they're foraging on plants around the site, and that you shouldn't spray flowers directly while bees and other pollinating insects are visiting that site. And you want to minimize drift onto bee hives and pollinator habitat. Now, this is a little bit complicated because pollinator habitat isn't always what you directly think about, right? So it's not just the flowers of interest to you. It can also include weed flowers like dandelions and wild clover. And pollinator habitat can mean a lot of different things depending on the pollinator, right? So honeybee hives are easy to spot, but many bee species nest in the ground or in stems in the wood. If you see flowers or bee activity, then you can probably bet it's important habitat for pollinators. Under directions for use, you're also going to find some statements about pollinating insects and beneficials. So, do not apply while the bees are foraging. Wait until petal fall for your target crop before you apply, and spray after sunset or below 55 degrees when the bees are at least active. All right, and then finally, we're going to talk about another way to help beneficials is to limit access to your pesticide baits. So baits can be that are made for, so these rodenticide baits, to control rodents can be very attractive and toxic to wildlife. So for example, you probably heard that dogs can dig up rodenticides. What you want to do is use bait stations for rodent baits that are if they are formulated with food, then you want to place that where non-target wildlife cannot get to it, okay? And you also want to use these bait stations that can limit access. And you want to place them where wild animals, pets, and children aren't easily reaching them. Even children have interest in these kind of bait stations, right? Because they're curious. All right, now I've highlighted these last three things that I just talked about because for these last 3 points, in order to really follow these guidelines correctly, you have to know who your beneficials are and what their habitats are. Okay, so for example, one of the tips that we talked about was not to spray when pollinators are actively foraging. But foraging activity varies species to species, okay? So I showed a picture of squash here. Squash bees visit the squash flowers really early in the morning, which is when the squash flowers open up, okay? So even though more generalist bees are active in the middle of the day, if you're a squash farmer, you might want to think about, even in the morning, it's really important to think about your beneficial bees, right? So there's always exceptions to the rule. And that's why it's really important to know who the beneficials are in your area. And that's why you should contact Extension or the IPM program to learn more about the habits of beneficials and more about their life histories so that you can understand how to protect them. All right, so let's talk a little bit about selecting a product. The label can actually help you select that product. So before you go to buy a product, the first step would be to make sure that the target pests and the site listed are on the label, are listed on the label, right? And that it will control the right life stage of your pest. You also want to be sure that you're able to apply the pesticide when you need to. There's no restrictions on that timing. And you want to make sure that you're going to be able to abide by the label restrictions. If the re-entry interval is 48 hours, then you have to make sure that you can do that. And you want to do all that before you buy the pesticide. You also want to make sure that you have the necessary personal protective equipment. And if you don't, that you can buy it before you even purchase the pesticide. Okay, once you've done all of that, let's say you have a couple pesticides that meet these criteria. Well, the second thing would be, how do you choose between pesticides? And so this is where you can kind of, select those that are least toxic and hazardous to people. That'll be the first thing to look at. All right, so look at the safety information, the signal words that we talked about, and select ones that would pose a lowest chance of exposure. So for example, we talked about bait stations or ant bait instead of spray, right? So think about exposure. And then select those that are least likely to harm beneficials, okay? So that's where you'd be checking the label language to see if there's any warnings about birds, pollinators, fish, or aquatic invertebrates. And be overly cautious, okay? So for instance, even if there isn't a bee box on the label, the EPA's website actually states that most insecticides are toxic to bees, which isn't, terribly shocking because they are insecticides and they're meant to kill insects, right? So just assume that all insecticides might pose a risk to bees, even if it's not listed on the label. And you can, if you treat it as such, you can be a little more cautious, right? Another example, even if an insecticide is only labeled for terrestrial use, if it is, then, even if it doesn't have statements about aquatic organisms or fish, you can assume that it might be toxic to those beneficials, okay? And if you treat it that way, you can only do good, right? So you can always exercise more caution than what's required by the label. And I think that is all that I have. I'm open for questions. There's my email, but I also wanted to say that there's some resources. I think that Deb is going to share these with you after the talk. So check these out. We have a fact sheet, a couple different fact sheets, and we have, I based a lot of this talk on the EPA and National Pesticide Information Center's tips on reducing pesticide exposure to wildlife. Okay, so
we have some questions already. Well, the first one is, does the EPA do their own testing, excuse me, on products, or do they rely on the manufacturer's provided data only? Or is there an independent agency or several agencies that do the testing?
All right, that's a great question. Yes, most of the time, I think it is the manufacturer that does the testing and sends that into the EPA. However, the EPA is a really intensive review process. And they have, there's a huge list of criteria for all of these studies to meet the EPA's criteria. So I think most of the time it is the manufacturer, it's not the EPA usually. It's a good question.
And so let's see, I've always been confused by the lack of labeling on deer repellents containing putrescent egg solids.
Okay.
And someone mentioned, and then there's also, is there a pest management guide from CCE that is designed for lawn and garden home property owners? And maybe Deb, do you want to talk about the program that, or the resource that you've been working on? It is one of the issues that is always a problem, because pesticide information does change pretty frequently. And so keeping up with what's out there is tough. Oh, here's a really interesting one. Any information about avocado seeds repelling or killing rodents?
Huh. That's an interesting one. I don't know if that would fit under my talk, because that would have to, if it was a pesticide, it'd have to be a chemical or substance, right? So they'd probably have to derive something from that seed for it to be considered a pesticide. So that might be one of those IBM questions. Yeah.
We get a lot of questions about things that are sort of home remedies, and often they have not been tested. And often they do also pose some risk.
Yeah, and I would say, I didn't get into home remedies in this talk, but I would definitely encourage you to use pesticides that are registered, only because that testing has been done, right? And so it's more clear on the label that the testing has been done and like what the risks are. And actually, using home remedies is illegal in the state. So I would really encourage you to use registered pesticides. The other thing that I was just thinking about, the question about the EPA risk assessment, right? So even though that data can be, the studies can be conducted by the manufacturer, they are scientifically peer reviewed, right? So they have to go through that process. So there's going to be a review panel of scientists, and that allows for that objectivity.
And Deb put in a response, because our home and garden guides are cultural methods and do not address specific pesticide products, but our website does lead to many resources for proper use in gardens and lawns. And so Hillary is asking about good resources about home remedies, and the concept of communicating with the public about this. And she said, I see a lot of wild things in Facebook garden groups, which is absolutely true. The other thing is something that's come up that I've seen. This is someone who's looking at them for greenhouses, but she's been getting some of the products that are sold online as pesticides and finding out that many of them are not what they say. And also some of them have both toxic substances in them, but also other issues that affect human health. So just because you can buy something on the internet and just because it says it will do something, this label piece is really important. It is also, in my opinion, completely frustrating. So I charge you all to go out and find a pesticide in your house if you have one, or go to the next time you go to the store and look and see if you could find all the information that is supposed to be there, and sometimes it's hard to find, even on the commercial.
Yeah, and Betsy's not wrong. I mean, it is there. It's often difficult to find, but you can talk to our program and talk to me if you have any questions. We're happy to help you with reading the label. And yes, I mean, I definitely think another thing on home remedies is that they often include the same active ingredients that are in some of these registered pesticides, but without all those safety precautions. So yeah, you want to be really careful what you're looking at. And in order to see if something's registered, I mean, look for the EPA registration number. It has to be on there. So if you see an EPA registration number, then you know that has gone through this registration process.
Ruth said you make an appointment with OCRRA to drop off pesticides, and I don't know what that is. Ruth, what's that? If you want to unmute yourself, you could answer.
It's Okra in Onondaga County.
Oh, in Onondaga County.
Yes.
Okay. Each county may have
their own waste.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
they could.
So, each county probably has their own waste removal options. I mentioned Clean Sweep New York, but I'm not sure actually how wide.
That's commercial. Actually,
Okay.
Clean Sweep, and so yes, that was put in. That's commercial. But if you can check with your local waste management or with the county, and usually find them. Matt Fry also put in a comment. Unfortunately for rodents, there is a lack of efficacy information for repellents the much better option is pest exclusion to keep them out. And you can find resources about pest exclusion for rodents and other pests at www.pestexclusion.org, which that's in the chat there. And we'll put that on our list of resources that we also have.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to, there was that statement about deer repellent. So if you have concerns that, you think, oh, there should be a statement on the label, but I'm not seeing, about toxicity or concerns about any sort of beneficials, you can reach out to the EPA. You can actually, they take public comments on these chemicals and are always trying to update label language, right? So talk to me and I can help you figure out how to do that.
Oh, and Anita said it's .com, not .org. Thank you, Anita.